All right. So I would like to kind of think a little bit more about anti-blackness, anti-blackness in the Caribbean, and specifically just like anti-Rastafarian sentiment. I feel like it's not something that's new. It's old, but after revisiting like a very nostalgic media text, I thought it was appropriate to kind of just talk through some of my thoughts, feelings, and then kind of weave through some of the historical landscape that I think is important for us to consider, and just additional thoughts moving forward. So, before we move forward, I'm going to invite you to like, comment, subscribe, and please share this. And if you have any suggestions about other things that I should talk about, let me know. And yeah, all right, let's move forward. It's 1980, and the Jamaica Labour Party's Edward Seaga just ends up securing his electoral win against former Prime Minister Michael Manley, who was, of course, the head of the People's National Party. Now, this particular shift in of like political hands is incredibly important for this time period, especially in the year of 1880, when we know that Ronald Reagan ends up becoming the 40th president of the United States, which has huge repercussions for the Caribbean. For the world, right? There's Ronald Reagan, and then we got Margaret Thatcher on the other side of the world, and her austerity, just like making life like super duper 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 hard for people who ended up migrating there. So we get Ronald Reagan as the president of the United States. He's inaugurated, and 9 days after his inauguration, he invites Edward Seaga to a 2-hour meeting to the White House, which, girl. So we know exactly why Edward Seaga was invited to the White House, right? Like, we know that the United States wanted to make sure that all the players or the political actors in their backyard were doing exactly what the United States wanted them to do. Be good players in terms of this Cold War that we're fighting, and make sure that you're not acting up in my backyard, because if you start acting up in our backyard, we're gonna make sure that you understand that we're not playing with you. So we know, like, some of the things that were like the United States wanted to kind of cut off at that time was the very leftist, the very progressive, the pro-black, the pan-Caribbean, and communist-friendly posture that was evident in the region, which was obviously antithetical to what the United States wanted. And so let's listen to the Jacksonville Journal and what they had to say about the meeting and some of the key points of the United States agenda in the region. So, the Jacksonville Journal described the January 29th meeting as, quote, the invitation to Seaga to make an official visit so early in the new administration was seen as a gesture of support to one of avowedly democratic, pro-Western, anti-Cuban, and pro-free enterprise. And in return, Reagan pledged the goodwill, cooperation, and moral and material assistance of the United States. Which essentially, we can say it happened in the 1980s, right? A lot of that rah-rah Black Power stuff, girl, by the 1980s. And I mean, I would also argue that, like, we are essentially in this particular moment in 2024 as we transition from the Joe Biden administration to a Donald Trump administration. A lot of the rah-rah, that we've kind of seen and bear witness to for the past 10 years, I want to say that kind of started with just a lot of the very, like, opaque, in your face lynchings that we've seen happen throughout the United States, and just the outpouring of, like, anger and distress from Black people and people of color for the past 10 years. That anger from folks of color, white people not having it right now. White people are not having it right now. And in the same vein, we can see that like the brown middle class was, in terms of their support, was waning in terms of like their support for Rastafarians at this particular time. And we see that the entertainment sector also ends up taking a right along with the political landscape. So before I feel like I want to go further into talking about this, I think it's important for me to just kind of like name what Rastafarianism is, and just like some of the historical, like, you know, the historical trajectory of this religious decolonization movement, so that we're both on the same page. So, according to the introductory text, Comprehending Rastafari, by Ennis Edmonds, he names that like the residue of the Great Revival in the 1860s carried over into the 1930s. Which is where we start to see like the seeds of Rastafarianism kind of start to kind of grow. What's also important is that like the 1930s was Paddington in terms of labor movements, and just like Black people again advocating for themselves and their relationship to labor in the colonial state of Jamaica. And so this is the time period where we get like teachers unions and nursing unions and like all these different unions. Also, other Astrid, it's also not a coincidence that like if you look at statistics or just like the percentages of people that are unionized, particularly in New York City, people who are actively participating in their unions, for the most part, the highest population of Black people who are in unions are indeed Black West Indian people, which is directly tied to this moment of the 1930s and Black people just not taking any sort of foolishness. And we see currently, as I am making this video, that there's also like ongoing protests in terms of the hospitality sector in Jamaica, because again, like there's just, I guess, and I think Orlando Patterson was someone who argued this. I don't remember the name of the book, but I'll put the name down here. But like argued that like there's almost like a vein of anarchy that is apparent in the just like Jamaican political landscape, which makes sense to me. And in the sense of just like, we will flip this whole table over if you think that you're going to be in our face telling us this foolishness and dehumanizing for your gain. You know, there's been, and also just like the long history of the system of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, the fact that like if you were somebody that was enslaved in, you know, the Caribbean, your lifespan was significantly shorter than people who were you know, enslaved on the mainland of the United States. You know, your lifespan for the most part in the, you know, the Caribbean was about 5 to 7 years, and like the ongoing violence where people were literally working 24 hours a day, of course, ensured that like, you know, the mortality of these people was like incredibly like high. The 1930s is where we see kind of just the seeds of Rastafarian kind of prop up, and some of that revivalist baggage kind of supporting that. Now, usually when we think about like revivalism and things of that nature, and especially like the people with the microphones on the street telling everybody that they're gonna go to hell, like we think of that, like you breathe too hard, like you're going to hell. Okay, you look at me too hard, like you're going to hell, right? However, what's interesting about the people who kind of end up kind of leading us toward Rastafarianism is that like the you're going to hell part was attached to, if you're participating in this system of British colonialism, yes, baby girl, you're going to hell, which work. We see that like some of that revivalism, that vein of revivalism, ends up informing someone very famous that y'all might know, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, you know. And so, his earlier teachings kind of support this idea of a king, showing up, in the form of his imperial majesty. Now, what's interesting is that Marcus Garvey doesn't necessarily kind of live to see, like a lot of the fruits of his labor. But he does end up kind of like naming that, like, yeah, there's gonna be a black king that's gonna pop up from somewhere, and that black king was Haile Selassie, from Ethiopia. What's interesting about Ethiopia too, especially at this moment, is that like it is what we would consider like black excellence of the moment. It's the visually speaking, like it's the first sort of representation that a lot of people have in terms of a black monarchy, especially for people in the diaspora, where it's like you're literally generations and generations separated from, like a lot of this representation. For people who are continental Africans, it's like, yeah, girl, like, yeah, royalty is like not a huge deal. But for those of us in the diaspora, of course, this was a huge deal because people in positions of power always look white, or had some sort of proximity to whiteness. So to see someone, especially a black person, having this particular power and having that power be recognized by other people who were in other monarchies, especially the British monarchy, that was a huge deal. So also something for us to consider is that, like, alongside the Rastafarian movement, there were other alongside this particular movement of Rastafarianism, there's also other black liberation movements that prop up alongside it, right? So we're thinking of, for example, the Harlem Renaissance, which we know Marcus Garvey was a part, the Norris movement in Haiti, the Afro-Cubismo movement in Cuba, the Conciencia movement in the Conciencia Negra movement in Brazil, the Negritude movement in the Francophone Caribbean, and also Francophone Africa, right? And of course, Paris. And so we have these movements kind of popping up all over the world. And then we also know that, like, in terms of the leadership of like the early Rastafarianism at this time, we know that Leonard Howell was the first Rasta, alongside other people like Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert, Robert Hines, and Henry Archibald Dunkley. So one of the things that we kind of know to be just like true, Rastafarianism was consistently at odds with the British colonial order and was frequently repressed throughout the lifespan of the movement. He invited people who were in St. Thomas to basically stop paying taxes to a repressive colonial government, and stand up to the white domination, because we know that essentially those taxes were given right to the royal family in, Britain, who hasn't worked a day in their life. So again, in other ways that these people basically push back against the system, of course, they, and this is also kind of like in the imagination of how we kind of see Rastafarians. These are people who were living off the grid, and about 500, some people would say 500 to 2,000 people kind of ended up moving into these spaces, living in tiny homes, living off the grid, creating distance between themselves and just the rest of the colonial order. And of course, like, this distance, also came with other visual markers, like, for example, like visual markers that we're very aware of today. The growing of locks, the growing out of facial hair, the diction, and engaging in, marijuana as religious sacrament. All of these things end up kind of being cemented as a part of the culture by the 1940s. However, right, on the flip side, we know that we know that society at large didn't necessarily receive Rastafarians very well at this time period. So here is where we get to see like a lot of the social ire towards this group of people. We're talking about just like the stereotypes that were like, these people are super lazy, these people, they're not in their right mind, they're criminals, they're nasty, and they're dirty. And of course, with all of these negative stereotypes that are attached to this group of people, then that means that these people end up, or excuse me, society at large gives social permission to the state to engage in state violence, to brutalize these people whenever they wanted to, because we don't care about these people anyhow. I feel like a way that, I feel like I talked about this a little bit on my channel, talking about Bashment Granny and just like the queer body and its relationship to the state, and how the police officer in Bashment Granny, basically told other people, hey, close your eyes. Like, do you want me to shoot this nigga? And excuse me, right? Like, so we see that like, overall, right, like people kind of close their eyes and give permission to the state in order to engage in the violence that they did engage in with Rastafarians. And let me tell you something, it was brutal. There are, and I'll try to leave a link to, like some of the oral histories. I think the YouTube channel is called like I Never Knew or something like that. And there are Rastafarians who give verbal accounts. My father is one of not on that channel, but my father is one of the people who like bear witness to Rastas being trim at this time. So it was just an incredibly violent time. And not to mention that like, we are still in 2024 seeing the ways in which people are, like that teenager in Zinga who was apprehended by the police, whose hair was cut off, right? So we know that this has been an accessible form of violence by the state. So again, yes, Rastafarians, they were brutalized, they were harassed, and it's something that has been like just a consistent exercise of the state in order to continue to repress this particular group of people. So by 1966, the Jamaican government decides to invite Haile Selassie to the island. And mind you, Haile Selassie ends up making just like sweeping a tour of the British Caribbean, if you will. I think he went to Trinidad and Tobago first. So by 1966, he shows up on the island. My dad actually told me that he was there. I think he was about probably like 7 years old, he told me. And the fanfare was wow. Just like the images just show just like visually just like a sea of people ready to see basically a black king. I feel like for many of us, like we lived through the fanfare of like Black Panther, but like for many people it was the first time that they were able to bear witness to an actual black king, and just how much that meant for so many people in the diaspora. I do want to underscore though that like while Haile Selassie has been an important figure in Rastafarianism and to black people in the British Caribbean, it's important for us to also understand that like, baby girl, when we talk to actual Ethiopians who have lived through the Haile Selassie regime, a lot of these people don't necessarily have the same flowery ideas of that man, because essentially he was a dictator to his own people. And so I think that history is also important for us to like hold space for, while he's important for us in the British Caribbean, because of the distance that we've had from our own histories and representation in terms of people in positions of power. It's important for us to also consider like what he was actually like as a leader and a dictator. Okay, so moving on. So 1966 ends up just really cementing the authority of Rastafarians, and just to see the fanfare of how people receive Haile Selassie, I basically again established just how important Rastafarianism had been for the larger public. And by the time we get to the 1970s, Black consciousness is already just like at the center of just like people's understanding of who they are and like how they navigate this space. I mean, by the 1970s, again, Michael Manley is the person who is in power during this decade. And I say this all the time to people in my life, but like while Michelle Obama was like the first lady in the United States, let me tell you something. Beverly Manley was Michelle Obama before Michelle Obama, okay? And I believe that there's like an image of her also visiting the White House with Michael Manley. Michael Manley basically served as a prime minister on the island at that time. In chapter 3 of Chanting Down Babylon, Rastafari and the exorcism of ideology of racism and classism in Jamaica, Barry Chevenix basically cites Carl Stone's electoral behavior and public opinion poll that was done in 1974. 68% of people who newly associated themselves with the People's National Party said that they were sympathetic to the plight of Rastafarians. They were sympathetic to the ideas that came with Rastafarianism at the time, versus 38% of people in the Jamaica Labour Party, which is of course the Conservative Party. So again, we see just like how important Rastafarianism was in terms of kind of pushing people towards thinking in a very leftist, progressive way and centering Blackness in their politics. So just to kind of tie this up, Rastafarianism, of course, is a livity. It's a way of life. It is an active form of decolonization. It is a decolonization project that basically works to unpack the ways in which white supremacy has informed so many aspects of your life, on the very intimate, components of your life and your human experiences, and also thinking about just like the larger hegemonic order and the ways in which people engage in, how to do that. Some of this means like, not combing your hair and ensuring that you're growing out locks. Other ways that people engage in this is like, ensuring that they're not necessarily eating foods that resemble just like the colonial dominant order, engaging in eating Aita food, and engaging with their spirituality in a way that like is deeply anti-capitalist. And I think that that's something that's like very, very important within the framework of Rastafarianism. And not just seeing it as just this flowery thing that people do as just like Black hippies, but essentially like a legitimate political framework and a legitimate spiritual framework in order to kind of like create distance between yourself and white supremacy. And yeah, like it is a legitimate form of thinking and a legitimate way of being. Now, transitioning to anti-Rastafarian sentiment in the media. So one of the spaces where, like, mind you, I have watched this video so many times. So in the episode of like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is where I feel like that's a canon text. So yeah, like, and I also say that like that particular series, it kind of is right up there with Titus in Town, and that was performed, I think, by Glenn Campbell, and is also up there with kind of like the theatrical wave of comedy by people like actors like Keisha Bada Ramsey, who starred in Bashment Granny and like a whole bunch of other plays as well. So Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, for me, I'm not even just gonna say for me, but just essentially captures the brown middle class's anxiety around the distance that they wanted to create for themselves away from the Rastafarians of the Black Power movement, and just the many, just I guess the rah-rah social justice warriors of social justice warriors, leftists, communists, this. These were the people who wanted to create distance between themselves and, those people. And of course, we know that the vast majority of the people who were engaged in, like piping up against the system were indeed black, and again, like black dark-skinned people. A lot of the distance that we know was created, was also by the brown middle class, who didn't necessarily want to be associated with this because they wanted to get to the bag and ensure that their proximity to whiteness wasn't at risk. This couple by the name of the Robinsons, who have like this beautiful suburban home in Kingston, Jamaica. And we have Mrs. Jane Robinson and Mr. Robinson, who are waiting for their only daughter, Donna, and her new partner, to come by and like basically have an introductory dinner, at 7:00, just to say, hey, mom, dad, blah, blah, blah. This is my boyfriend, yada, yada, yada. And, it's interesting because it's like watching the episode, you notice that like the couple is like arguing, and even as they argue, there's not a trace of patois in the entire exchange. And the only person that we'll see in this particular video that ends up speaking in patois is Oliver, which again, boom, another social marker of just like blackness and distance that they want to create for themselves. I think the reason why Oliver ends up being the person who speaks the most patois in the text is because it's also a demonstration of like a lack of civility, a lack of, being able to speak properly, which is something that Mrs. Robinson does name. I think she says something in the video about like, does he speak English? So again, just kind of like there's just this clear line of demarcation that is consistently created between the brown people in the video and, the black person, Oliver, in the video. So, the daughter, she shows up on a bike. The mom is petrified, and just a lot of like pearl clutching that's like unnecessary. So here we see it. I think one of the things that was really notable to me is like in this episode, we see the Jamaican social left and the Jamaican social right awkwardly have to negotiate space between each other through their daughter, right? The only reason why they're even having a conversation with each other under the same roof is because of this woman, Donna. So Donna to me also represents like the mainstream uptown middle class girl who like wants to engage in black consciousness within the tightly bound social networks of the brown middle class. So she wants to do it and she has the power to do it, but she also has the power to take everything off and throw it away when she's done with engaging with these black politics, which is exactly what happens by the end of the episode. So, Oliver ends up being someone who kind of like performs this persona of a Rastafarian. He basically like shows up in a bomber jacket, a shirt that's red, green, and gold and black. He has on the red, green, and gold tam, and the same thing. Donna walks in, she struts in with this beautiful long tie-dye dress, a yarn tam covering all her hair. You don't see her hair. And just again, it's just like a lot of these colors and dress that is again associated with these undesirable Rastafarians that no one wants to be in proximity to. So lots of pearl clutching. Some of the jokes, some of the things that are supposed to be funny, it's like for example, like the things that are supposed to be funny is like supposed to be like the diction of the Rastafarians, like the decolonization of their speech is supposed to be really funny. So of course, like Oliver ends up performing that for the audience. But then you also see like these interesting like barely nuggets of anti-capitalism that end up rolling out of of Oliver's mouth. So for example, the stepfather, Mr. Robinson, kind of leads, he basically ends up being the person to transition everybody from one thing to the other. So he ends up leading the questions with, like, for example, what do you do for a living? And Oliver responds in a very anti-capitalist way, saying, like, the same thing as you do, Mr. Robinson, and Mr. Robinson interrupts and says, oh, you're into construction as well. Like, hey, that's a good job. And Oliver ends up responding, like, construction is what you do for a livelihood. What you do for a living is eat, sleep, and give thanks. And of course, then Mrs. Robinson interjects, don't you work? So, like, yeah, that's cute and everything like that. But in the system of capitalism, I need you to make money. And then we also get into just like the moral panic of, marijuana. I think we're currently in another wave of moral panic around marijuana, especially because of the decriminalization and the legalization of marijuana. And, here in the text, you kind of see Oliver talk about, like, which is supposed to be funny, that, I are a singer of songs and a player of instruments. And Mr. Robinson's like, oh, really? What instruments do you play? Well, normally I man play the triangle, but when I man smoke, I man play anything: drums, piano, organ, trombone, trumpet, violin, cello, anything. And just goes on and on and on. And I think this kind of taps into just like the fact that, like, we know that Rastafarian people exist everywhere along the political spectrum up to a certain point. But a lot of times, like, in terms of people who are very visual to the public, a lot of these people end up being in the arts. Not to say that there aren't politicians and there aren't other people who are, I don't know if Damien Crawford is a Rastafarian. Like, maybe somebody can correct me, but I believe he is. If he's not, somebody correct me. But, like, essentially they exist everywhere. But where there's like a overrepresentation of Rastafarians is definitely in the sphere of the arts, which again is touched here. Now, one of the things that I have a couple more things to name and then I'm gonna close out, but reggae music is, like, what's interesting is, like, here there's a part in the video where Oliver Samuels, he is kind of like pushed to go ahead and perform a song for her parents, and he says he made a song for Donna. Oh my gosh. And then the mom basically kind of like responds like, is this appropriate for airplay, or is this worthy for airplay? And Oliver responds, strictly conscious lyrics. I'm gonna deal with slackness, which, couple things about this, I think this also gets into, like, number one, the moral panic of reggae music and its attachment to the civil rights movement, and also like the budding of dancehall. And just like by the time we get to the 1980s and like by the time we get to especially the 1990s, like we see that like the a lot of the taboo things that are not necessarily accepted by the predominantly Protestant country. Jamaica has like the most churches per capita in any state, in any place in the world. So because of this dominance of Christianity and Protestant Christianity and Puritanism, like by the time we get to the 80s and by the time we get to the 1990s, we see a lot of that raunchy, dance hall that a lot of people aren't necessarily like wanting to attach themselves to. And also too, by the 1980s, like reggae music ends up kind of taking a bit of a nosedive on the island itself, but not globally. White people are still buying records. Like the shirt that I have is actually like merch. I don't know if you can see. It's actually merch from the time period. This is merch from Black Uhuru. And so, yeah, like we know that reggae music was an extension of that civil rights movement, and of course the brown middle class not necessarily having it. Nowadays, however, the brown middle class has some different feelings about reggae music, but some of the same feelings that they had about reggae music at the time is like the ire that they have for dancehall now. And the last thing that I'll say before I move on is like the conservative impulses that kind of come from Rastafarians. I noticed like in response to just like, again, a lot of the stereotypes that we know were prevalent in the 1940s, we see some real like impulses to conservatism. There's another scene. There is another scene where Oliver Samuels is asked, or Oliver in the video is asked, tell us about your family. And Oliver's like, I have one brother, but that nigga's in jail. And Mrs. Robinson is like, prison, you want a criminal? Well, essentially that's kind of the posture. And Donna's like, an innocent victim of society's injustices, trying to clean it up. But if we really think about the history of Rastafarians, yes, many of these people were murdered and like martyrs, and like victims of a system that was established for the colonial order. And so it's interesting that like this is something that's named, but like again the posture is like, well, Mr. Robinson asks like, okay, what's he in prison for? And he's like, larceny. So again, just kind of like naming like, oh yeah, like a lot of these people that you guys are saying are, victims of the system are actually just criminals. And you guys have always been criminals, and the Smithsonian basically did like this wonderful presentation of just like Rastafarians and just like the history. And if you still want to see it, it's not necessarily at in Washington DC anymore. It's actually in Jamaica at the museum in Montego Bay. So please go ahead and like take a look at it, because like it gets like you get to see a lot of the images and just like a real kind of understanding of just the many people who unfortunately whose civil rights were violated, and who the civil rights leaders of the Caribbean, and how important they are to all of us. So there's another scene where basically she's calling Rastafarians dirty. It's like all the stereotypes that we just talked about earlier, like historically, boom, 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 right in this episode. So, there's a part in the video where like Donna and Oliver, they kind of peck, kiss. And Mrs. Robinson is like, is his mouth hygienic? Ugh. You're gonna touch your lips on a black person? And I mean, yeah, it's interesting because it's like by this time, I guess I'm not shocked, because I guess what's interesting to me is that like when we think about Jamaica, especially outside of Jamaica, it's like Rastafarians are the people who are like the image of what culture looks like, on the island. And then when you get on the actual island itself, everybody hates these people. And what's so interesting is that like so much of the progress that we have made, especially in the 20th century, has been because of these people. So it's just really, really interesting. I want to the last thing for real, is there's a last one of the last scenes in the video where there's this distancing of like the mom is like really trying to get her daughter to distance herself from being African. And so Oliver and Donna, they talk about like wanting to have kids and get married and all these different things. And, Oliver's like, yeah, we're going to have so many little Africans running around. And her mom is like, African? My daughter's Jamaican. And like, it's so weird because it's like I know that the one drop rule doesn't necessarily hold any water in the Caribbean, but it's like, yeah, like if there was ever any evidence that like the brown middle class doesn't necessarily is its own category in itself, it is this. And the mom gets so upset at even the idea of her daughter being associated with being African, because again, like being African in this context is just like an insult. So interesting. So we also get into just like the lack of sensitivity of like dietary restrictions and like dietary restrictions that are social. So like when I think of this, I think of like, people who are concerned about global boiling and wanting to not eat any meat or any dairy in order to kind of ensure that we're not destroying the planet because of the things that we're eating. Which is a lot more common today. But at the time, Rastafarians were the first people that I've ever known of to be engaging in not eating certain foods because of just like a social, political framework. So in the video, you see that Mrs. Robinson, the knife in the the end of the whole conversation ends up kind of presenting some roast chicken with like, and mind you, I feel like for many Rastafarians it's like chicken, like ain't nobody eat no chicken, like you can never give my dad chicken, like what is that? But anyways, this is like for entertainment purposes, and so they present like a roast chicken to Oliver with bacon trimmings, like there's strips of bacon all over it, and it was a big thing. So by the end of the video, the daughter ends up kind of like letting her parents know that it was all like a huge prank because she really just wanted to kind of like twist their arm so they could send her to Disney World. I mean, like, it's the 1980s and you in Jamaica and you got money to go to Disney World? Girl. And then by the end of the video, it's like, okay, yeah, it's a huge prank. Oh my gosh, look, it's like Oliver. Like, you guys know Oliver. Oh my gosh, thank God it was just a prank. And like, everybody was just pranking us. And you're not really like a black man, like trying to date our light-skinned daughter. Phew. And so socially violent. And so by the end, Oliver takes off the locks and, she kind of lets go of this entire persona of this like, brown conscious person who is so socially engaged. And once again, they get to distance themselves from blackness and, end up, by the end of the video saying Irie, and it's so distasteful. And I'm curious to know like what Rastafarians have said about this, or whether they engage with this material at all. But I do believe that this did in fact have a impact, because there's so many of us that know this episode by heart. Like I could tell you, I could watch this video and like name some of the lyrics or the lines by heart. So yeah, this is where I am. I hope you're able to see some of the lines or the connections that I was making. The 1980s, again, just to close off, was a time where our politics made a hard right turn. And our entertainment also made a hard right turn. And I anticipate that we're going to see more of this. Valiant, I believe it was a year or two ago, made a video, like some Rasta nonsense video a few years ago, that I I I was flabbergasted at just the lack of reverence to our civil rights leaders. I think I think especially because someone like Valiant, who is like a Gen Zer, didn't necessarily grow up um, experiencing a lot of the racial violence that the elders experience. And so it's easy to take them for granted. It's easy to make fun of them. ITM Fancy Cat is another one. It's easy to make fun of these people, and take a lot of their postures and their punching up at the system as like something that, like, you know, people who are mentally unwell are just doing, and like none of it makes sense. But in fact, a lot of their like engagement in you know, or how they move through the world is deliberate, it's intellectual. And, you know, again, Rastafarianism is a decolonization project and must be, you know, like respected as such. And it shouldn't take for white people to be buying, you know, Chronix's album and Protege's, you know, selling out Protege's tour for Rastafarianism to be legitimate to us. You know, I think it is in these times where we need to hold on to the, you know, the many important pillars of that movement. And while I don't agree with everything, like, I consider myself a Black feminist. And so just like the posture of how, you know, Rastafarianism ends up engaging with gender and sexuality is something that I wholly disagree with. I do think that there are very important parts of Rastafarianism that we need to render in order to support ourselves in the many years to come under the orange clown, and the many other clowns in power. Thank you so much. I hope you come back. Leave a comment, leave a like. I'm a small axe. You're a small axe. This is a small axe. Love you so much. Bye.